I cannot believe that I have gotten to this point in the podcast. This is my 12th full-length monthly episode, meaning this episode completes an entire year of Written in Blood history. I'm not going to get all sappy on you in this intro. That'll come later. Right now, I need to introduce my final subject of Season 1. Oh, and by the way, the subject of this episode was a blunt and at times vulgar and insensitive person by today's standards. Because I will be quoting from him, it should be expected that there will be some rough language, so this is an official language warning. And while I try to avoid being gratuitous, I don't want to present a false image of the subject either. So if this type of language is a problem for you, then now is the time to tune out. Imagine if you had someone as prolific in battle as Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar who lived in the 20th century. And with all the information that would be available on their life, there's simply no way you could contain it all in a roughly 1-hour podcast. That's the problem with doing an episode on Patton. He served not in one but 2 world wars, and not to mention many other escapades. With the overwhelming amount of information on this guy, I decided that it needed to be split into 2 parts. And don't worry, you're not going to have to wait a whole month to hear the second part. I'll only delay it by about a week or so. Besides being my first 2-part episode, another really awesome part of these episodes is the orchestra music that my music guy Dario has worked out. He took Tchaikovsky's Overture of 1812 and abridged it into a few smaller versions for me to use as bumper music, and he killed it. The 1812 Overture was a piece I listened to over and over again while writing this episode, and so I couldn't be more thrilled that I get to use it to bookend the life of Patton. And so enough of my rambling. Turn your volume up as we get thrown into the life experiences of Patton, the master of the sword. It was 5 a.m. The artillery fell silent, leaving behind plumes of smoke hanging heavy over the French battlefield. The smell of gunpowder lurked in the air. The aura of a battlefield was intoxicating to the young lieutenant colonel. At precisely 6:10 a.m., Patton gave the order for his tanks to move toward the German positions. It was risky. Tanks had seen little combat thus far. They were a new weapon. They were untested. They were envisioned by their commander to be the new cavalry. But the risk was worth it for Patton. The tank could move faster than infantry. It could repel almost all machine gun fire. It could roll over the trenches. The tank was heavily armored, fast, and if used correctly, it was deadly. If anything was going to break the dismal stalemate of trench warfare, it would be the tank, and Patton knew it. He lifted his binoculars to his eyes, and he caught sight of some of his lead tanks getting bogged down in the mud of the battlefield. This could not happen, for Patton's tanks must always be moving forward, always forward. To stall was to die. And so the lieutenant colonel briskly left the command post and marched the 2 miles to the stalled tanks. His boots were black, freshly oiled and polished. His shining helmet glistened under the French sky. And yet, enemy gunfire and mortars exploded all around him. When Patton reached the stalled tanks, he scolded his men for getting stuck in the first place. The swear words poured from his mouth like vomit, but in an instant his berating morphed into profane words of encouragement, motivating his men, cursing at them, inspiring their manhood, reaching into their stomachs and willing their courage to the surface. In the presence of George Patton, his men were often more afraid of him than the enemy, and they made short order of getting the tanks unstuck from the mud and on the move again. But instead of returning to his command post, Patton stayed with his men. In fact, he marched in front of them. Glorious must have been the sight of a single soldier in his crisp and flawless uniform, followed behind with these primeval tanks, these early and ugly guns on tracks. The enemy shelling continued, and still Patton marched forward, always forward. He relished in the mud and the blood. And at every near miss, the officers around the lieutenant colonel ducked and cowered, but not Patton. He was insistent on holding his composure. He scoffed at the idea of the, quote, futility of dodging fate, end quote. At such close range, it was customary for the officers to remove their rank emblems to avoid being identified as a high-value target on the battlefield. Patton notably left his in plain sight. He wanted his men to know that he was not afraid of being shot. And so, Patton, in every bit of military flair and decoration, led his men to, as he saw it, their destiny, whatever that may be. Amid the smoke and the gas and the explosions, Patton saw a figure standing tall on a hill ahead of his tank regiment. He climbed the hill, and he discovered another future titan of 20th century combat, General Douglas MacArthur. The men talked for a moment, but were interrupted by an oncoming German creeping barrage, a literal wall of shell explosions designed to crawl across the battlefield and clear the way for infantry forces. As this wall of fire and shrapnel approached, neither Patton nor MacArthur flinched. Neither would flee the enemy, at least not while the other was present. Patton later wrote in his journal, quote, "I think each of us wanted to leave, but each hated to say so we let it come over us." End quote. After this near-death experience, Patton left MacArthur behind on his hill to keep moving his tanks forward, always forward. Ahead of him he saw the French town of Essy, which was under heavy artillery barrage by the Germans, and under such heavy attack, a supporting French commander turned his tanks away from the town, fearing for the survival of his men. He saw the town as lost. But as Patton arrived and encouraged the retreating French forces, he took command of the French tanks and redoubled the American and French offensive. Approaching the main bridge to the town of Essy, Patton crossed it first, on foot, a single soldier, with thundering hell on wheels behind him, his beloved tanks. Patton's shining black boots set foot upon the soil of Essy with artillery exploding all around him. His tanks rolled past, swiftly taking the town. Essy was his in minutes. The next French town on the map was Panne, and so instead of holding or waiting for reinforcements or further instructions, Patton ordered his tanks forward, always forward. Approaching Panne, Patton's lead tanks began running out of gas. The ground infantry faltered in their assaults with no tanks to lead them or offer covering fire to protect them from the enemy. And cursing and spitting and kicking, Patton found a tank that still had some fumes in it and ordered it forward at the head of the infantry to lead the ground troops into Panne. When the driver hesitated, Patton jumped onto the tank, climbing its tracks, and stepped onto its gun to stare down the tank commander eye to eye, and again ordered him forward. As Patton was willing courage into this tank commander, some of his gassed-up tanks from the rear arrived on the scene. And thus was how Patton entered the city of Panne, riding aboard the hull of a tank, bracing its gun with stoic fearlessness, his uniform glistening in the sun, his mouth barking orders, his infantry and reserve tanks at his rear. As the Americans and French poured into Patton, with Patton at the front riding a tank, German machine guns opened fire. And outpositioned by the intense barrage, Patton and the tank company abandoned the vehicle and dove into a shell hole. He had no reinforcements behind him. He had utterly outpaced his infantry soldiers and reserve tanks. They were still some 300 yards behind and had no way of communicating with him. So he crawled out of his defilade, and under fire from machine guns and shells, he marched the 300 yards on foot back to the infantry. Coming up to the infantry commander, Patton ordered him forward to Pan. The commander refused, and no amount of cursing or kicking could force him. So Patton marched all the way back to Pan, where his tank corps had finally caught up and was regrouping. He ordered them to march forth to the next town on the map, the town of Benet. He then grabbed another tank and ordered it to transport him to the petrified infantry commander 300 yards back, and there he rallied the infantry around this tank and marched them himself on foot to Pan, capturing it, and then moved on to do the same at Benet, where he reunited with his beloved tank corps. The Imperial German Army, town by town, was in full retreat from Patton's tanks, Patton's tactics, and Patton's will. Later, when hearing the French tank battalions faltered at another assault, Patton borrowed a French uniform and appeared at the front to lead them. And he and his tanks navigated 5 miles of thick fog simply by heading towards the sound of gunfire. Finally, he encountered a swath of fleeing French soldiers at the hands of the Kaiser's army, but Patton halted their retreat and rallied them forward behind his tank battalion. In just a few short days, Patton's tanks were proving to be a powerful answer to the problem of trench warfare, although they still occasionally got stuck in the muddy fields of France. One day, Patton came upon a group of soldiers struggling to get their tanks out of a mud pit. He noticed every time they made any progress in extracting their stuck tank, a German shell would explode overhead, and they would all, understandably, hit the deck, allowing the tank to slink back into the mud. And so, Patton walked over, grabbed a shovel, and began digging. Shells exploded, machine gun rounds bounced off the metal hide of the tank, and Patton kept digging. Inspired by his example, the men grabbed their shovels, and with a renewed sense of courage, they got their tank out of the mud. Once dislodged, Patton threw down his shovel and raised his walking staff toward the Germans and shouted, quote, "Let's go get them! Who's with me?" End quote. As Patton led his men over the crest of the next hill, German machine guns were waiting, and as soon as they saw the lieutenant colonel with his tanks and infantry, they opened fire. In his journal, Patton admits that for a moment he experienced a sensation of fear. But allegedly, he looked up into the clouds, and he saw his progenitors looking down upon him. And then he said aloud, quote, "It is time for another Patton to die." End quote. Then, to a group of men who happened to be at his side, he ordered them to follow him in an obviously desperate charge down the hill into direct fire of German machine guns. Those around him were quickly picked off. Others got separated from the lieutenant colonel. Patton's orderly, a man named Angelo, looked around and realized that it was just him and Patton. And when the orderly made Patton aware of their desperate circumstances, he shouted back, quote, "Come on anyway." End quote. It was at this moment a bullet struck Patton's thigh, tearing open his flesh and exiting near his rectum. Angelo grabbed his commanding officer and shoved him into a shell hole for cover, where he cut a tourniquet to stem the bleeding. Once the tourniquet was complete, Patton ordered Angelo to notify his tankmen of certain machine gun positions that must be taken out for them to proceed. Just then, a sergeant appeared in the shell hole offering to help. Patton told the sergeant to find the next ranking officer and tell him to take command of the offensive. He also ordered the sergeant not to let any medics come to his rescue because the firing was too intense. But a medic came nonetheless. And after giving him a fresh bandage, Patton ordered the medic to move on to other wounded. When the battle finally ended, George Patton was carried out of the shell hole on a stretcher. As he was being transported to a hospital at the rear, he ordered the medics to stop at his command post so he could write his field report of the battle. And while Patton lay in the hospital recovering, back home in the United States, reporters were busily writing stories about a brave young lieutenant colonel marching at the front of his men against Imperial Germany, barking orders while bleeding in a shell hole. And he was only 33 years old. Many of you are familiar with the George C. Scott Patton film, and I think for most of us, that is about all we know of the man. But when I first encountered these events about George Patton in World War I realized the movie, while brilliant, barely scratched the surface. Who the hell is George Patton? What series of life circumstances and innate character, or better, what combination of nurture and nature creates a man who carries himself in the way he did on the World War I battlefield? The first thing that stands out when researching him is his utter public confidence, contrasted by his continual personal self-doubt, the latter revealed only in his private journal. He was also a magnificent anachronism. His romantic soldiery was out of sync with the 20th century American military, and for that matter, period social sentiments. He cursed without thinking twice. He was unfaithful to his wife, and yet was deeply devoted to prayer. He used derogatory racial slurs no matter who was in earshot, but allowed African American soldiers more prominent combat roles than most other American generals of the time. For everyone who loved the old general, there were as many who hated him. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, after the war, told an American journalist, quote, "Patton was your best," end quote. Even Stalin poured on praise, quote, "The Red Army could not have conceived and certainly could not have executed the advance made by the Third Army across France," end quote. But historian Dwight MacDonald was less charitable in his assessment, saying Patton was, quote, "a swaggering big mouth, a fascist-minded aristocrat, brutal and hysterical, coarse and affected, violent and empty. Compared to the dreary run of us, General Patton was quite mad," end quote. Andy Rooney of 60 Minutes fame said he, quote, "detested Patton and everything about the way he was. It was because we had so few soldiers like him that we won the war. Patton was the kind of officer that our wartime enlisted man was smarter than," end quote. Yet, his critics never dared attack his results. By the end of the conflict in the European theater in World War II, Patton's Third Army had liberated 12,000 cities. He had captured 1,280,680 prisoners. He'd killed 47,500 enemy combatants and wounded another 115,700. He had moved 1,234,529 tons of supplies. He built 2,498 bridges, a total of 8.5 miles. He reconstructed thousands of miles of European roads and rails, and he laid thousands of miles of communication wire. He understood resource logistics, maneuvered brilliantly on the battlefield, and designed tactics that ultimately beat back the army that invented the Blitzkrieg. He was also always nearly on the verge of being fired. Alan Axelrod, who wrote the biography that I'm using for this episode, perhaps summed it up more succinctly when he said, quote, "We admire Patton the captain, we relish Patton the legend, but we are, at the very least, uneasy with Patton the man," end quote. George Smith Patton was born November 11th, 1885, at Lake Vineyard, just outside of Los Angeles. His paternal heritage was military through and through. His grandfather, who was also a George Smith Patton, graduated at the Virginia Military Institute and became an acolyte of Stonewall Jackson during the American Civil War, where he commanded the 22nd Virginia Infantry. He was wounded, captured, released, returned to combat, and then eventually killed in battle. His son, Patton's father, was George William Patton, who was also affectionately called Papa by the young Patton. He also graduated from the Virginia Military Institute, but he opted not to go directly into the American military. Instead, he became a district attorney of Los Angeles for a time, and then left his professional career to focus on saving his family's vineyard. Patton knew well his ancestry beyond his grandfather. He knew he had a famous ancestor named Hugh Mercer, who, before immigrating from Scotland, fought against the English, and then once in America, he fought in the French and Indian War, and ultimately died with the rank of general fighting alongside George Washington at the Battle of Princeton. On his mother's side, Patton's grandfather was a trapper and Indian trader before settling down in California. He became a remarkably successful businessman known to the locals as Don Benito. Don Benito married his housekeeper and became the first mayor of Los Angeles and personally acquired 14,000 acres surrounding the city. Much of this land became known as Lake Vineyard, the place of Patton's birth. It was also the largest producer of wine and brandy in California at the time. As Patton grew, it became obvious to his father that he suffered from a severe learning disability, something that would today be diagnosed as dyslexia. And so, instead of letting his boy fall behind in education, Papa spent many long hours reading at his boy's side, and it was from the lips of Papa that Patton soaked up the works of Sir Walter Scott and Homer, Shakespeare, Kipling, and the Old Testament. The boy especially loved history, becoming enamored with the plights of Scipio Africanus, Hannibal, Caesar, Napoleon, Joan of Arc, Robert E. Lee, and of course, Stonewall Jackson. This devotion to the famed Confederate commander was fertilized by a family friend and veteran of the Civil War, the infamous gray ghost of the Confederacy, John Singleton Mosby. Mosby would take the young George upon his lap and tell him romanticized tales of his famous feats. At school, Patton was ridiculed by the other students for being unable to read or write, but strangely, he never thought of himself as being bullied or victimized. He himself recalls being, quote, the happiest boy in the world, end quote. It was not long before this happiest boy in the world grew tall, strong, rough, and athletic. One day while vacationing with his parents in 1902, the 17-year-old Patton met the daughter of a Boston industrial tycoon, Beatrice Banning Ayer. Being instantly love-struck, the pair began writing to each other immediately after their parting. And it was about this time that George Patton must have seriously began giving thought to his prospects in life. He was, by all observations, a brilliant young man, and yet no one could understand why reading and writing failed him. But after meeting Beatrice, Patton began to see his future crystallize before him, and his dyslexia would always prevent him from being something like a scholar, but it would not prevent him from being a soldier. Quote, I only felt it inside. It is as natural for me to be a soldier as it is to breathe, and would be as hard for me to give up all thought of it as it would be to stop breathing. End quote. When Patton made his desires clear, Papa was supportive, although he lamented the fact that his boy could never gain entry into a school like West Point. His inability to read would be an automatic disqualification. So Papa encouraged Patton to look at the Virginia Military Institute, the school of his heritage. And conveniently, it was also a place where Papa knew enough people to pull some strings for his boy. When touring the campus in Virginia, the young George remarked to his uncle Glazel that he feared he might be cowardly in battle. His uncle retorted, quote, no Patton could be a coward, end quote. Papa later clarified for George the meaning behind his uncle's unnuanced words, quote, while ages of gentility might make a man of your breeding reluctant to engage in a fist fight, the same breeding made him perfectly willing to face death from a weapon with a smile, end quote. Finally, in 1903, George Patton signed his papers to officially enroll in the Virginia Military Institute, the same school of his father and his grandfather. Before the ink was dry, the admissions officer leaned forward towards Patton's father, saying, quote, of course, you realize, Mr. Patton, that now your son is a cadet and he cannot leave the grounds. Of course, said Papa, end quote. When Patton went to the school's tailor for his uniform, the old man immediately recognized him as a Patton, and that he didn't have to measure him, for he had the same exact fittings as his father and his grandfather before him. Predictably, his dyslexia once again caused him to be the butt of many jokes among his classmates. Depressed at this continual albatross around his neck, he wrote to his father for advice. His father wrote back, quote, I do not see how you are going to overcome this difficulty, except by practicing reading all kinds of writing. Do not give it up. But when you start to read anything, keep at it until you work it out. End quote. Though Patton's dyslexia was a major hindrance to him, he had many personality traits going for him as a cadet. He was tough, he was resilient, and condescension or ridicule only drove him to be better, to overcome his flaws, to prove others wrong. And it was not long before the paradigm of the Virginia Military Institute entirely shifted for the young man. From Axelrod, quote, Cadet Patton became a model soldier, flawless in appearance and in execution of every movement of every drill. He memorized VMI regulations and followed them to the letter. An outside observer might have thought his devotion obsessive, even fanatical, but there were no outsiders at VMI. A third-generation cadet, he had marched into his birthright." End quote. Patton felt early on that he was different from his peers. After hearing a speech at the Military Institute about what a modern soldier stood for, the entire student body rose in applause. Quote, "I believe they all agreed with the speaker. I didn't. In fact, from what I have seen here at the Institute, I belong to a different class. A class perhaps almost extinct, or one which may have never existed, yet as far removed from these lazy, patriotic, or peace soldiers as heaven is from hell. I know that my ambition is selfish and cold, yet it is not a selfishness, for instead of sparing me, it makes me exert myself to the uttermost to attain an end which will do neither me nor anyone else any good. Of course, I may be a dreamer, but I have a firm conviction that I am not, and in any case, I will do my best to attain what I consider, wrongly perhaps, my destiny." End quote. After outshining his fellow cadets in just about every category, and after a tireless letter-writing campaign by his father to West Point, George Patton was finally accepted into that most prestigious of military academies. And despite his many talents for military education, he found quickly that being among the best of the best made for a tough row to hoe. To his father, he wrote, quote, "I actually think that if I do not get a promotion to corporal, I will die. I fancy that there is no one in my class who so hates to be last, or who tries so hard to be first, and who so utterly fails. It is beastly discouraging to get worse marks than the men who you know have less gray matter and not half the ambition." End quote. His father wrote back simply, "It is all right, my boy, and all for the best. God bless you." End quote. It was about this time that Patton began to keep a journal, to collect his thoughts and to focus on what he needed to improve upon to succeed at West Point. The very first entry of this journal was, quote, "Do your damnedest always." End quote. He soon thrust himself into the sports programs at West Point, where he was known for playing so hard he obtained more injuries than trophies. That is, except for horseback riding and fencing, both of which he was unrivaled in natural ability. One day, at a firing range, Patton's job was one of the many cadets tasked to stand at the far end of the safety of the trench and hold up targets for those practicing, and then score them. For whatever insane reason, it was in this moment he must have recalled his father's words about possessing the courage to face death from a weapon with a smile. He needed to know if he had it, and this was the perfect opportunity to find out. So he suddenly stood up above the trench, and the bullets of the gun range whistled by him and pierced the targets to his left and to his right. But he did not move. He proved, to himself at least, that he had courage. Confident now in his own spirit and nearing graduation, Patton needed to decide which part of the Army he would commit his life to. Though he loved the deep history of infantry combat, he knew to the cavalry went the glory. Quote, "I dare say that for every man remembered for his acts of peace, there are 15 made immortal by war. And since, in my mind, all life is a struggle to perpetuate your name, war is naturally my choice." End quote. But of course, after graduating West Point in 1909, there was no war, and nearly no American military at all. The military budget at the time was only $150 million, and most of that went to the Navy. Patton had found himself in one of the smallest armies in the world that had no enemies to fight. These facts, however, did little to quell his zeal. When Second Lieutenant Patton was drilling a group of men under him, the horse he sat upon bucked and threw him off. Patton immediately remounted, only to have the animal again try and toss him off. Only this time, Patton held on and refused to let go of the reins. Both horse and man fell sideways to the ground, and as Patton got himself out from under the animal, the horse quickly rose and knocked his head against Patton's, giving him a deep gash in his forehead. And with blood pouring down his face, he spent the next 20 minutes seeing the drilling of his men through to completion. He then went on to teach a scheduled class to a group of NCOs, followed by attendance at a class for junior officers. And finally, at the end of his day, he visited the surgeon to get stitches. On May 26, 1910, George Patton and Beatrice Ayers were finally married. On honeymoon, he spent his time reading military history books and proposing elements of a new type of warfare in his journal, something that in the next few years, the American military would adopt as, quote, offensive warfare. On this ethos, Axelrod says, quote, His message was compelling, and throughout a long career, it varied in detail but never wavered in principle. Almost everything he wrote was some variation of attack, advance, and attack again." End quote. Patton and Beatrice settled in Washington, D.C., and for a time they integrated themselves into the social military high society, and he was keenly aware of who he needed to ride horses with, or play polo with, or fence with, to earn a reputation with men who could advance his career. But his athletic ability was noticed beyond just the military. The Olympics were introducing a new sport, the pentathlon, and Patton was selected to represent the United States. For this, he trained hard, and he would have to. The pentathlon required a 5,000-meter steeplechase on horseback, then shooting a pistol at 25 meters, then a fencing match, then swimming another 300 meters, and then finally running a 4,000-meter foot race. He ultimately came in 5th place and excelled particularly in fencing. The Stockholm Press noted the American's, quote, "calm was unusual and calculated. He was skillful in exploiting his opponent's every weakness." End quote. Before leaving Europe, Patton took fencing classes with a famous French fencing instructor known only as Adjutant Clercy, who was regarded as the best fencer in the world. Patton took the lessons to heart, and he brought them back with plans on improving the American cavalry method with the sword. One difference in styles was the American cavalry's tendency for slashing over stabbing with a saber. Patton argued that stabbing with a straight blade is the quicker, deadlier, and more precise action to take. He in fact wrote an entire military manual on the theory of cavalry swordsmanship, and his arguments were so persuasive that the U.S. military officially created a new sword for its cavalry, and they called it the U.S. Army Saber M1913, or the Patton Sword. The Army then bestowed upon George Patton the honorary title of Master of the Sword, and he relished every moment of it. Just as Patton and Beatrice began having children, President Woodrow Wilson was experimenting with military interventionism in Mexico. Layered into the developing quagmire on the Mexican border were growing bands of raiding parties harassing the U.S. border towns. This potential flashpoint for a looming world war was precisely the reason Patton found himself stationed at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. From there, he was dispatched to support local law enforcement. From Axelrod, quote, "Patton was sent with his troops to Sierra Blanca, a rudimentary Texas border town of perhaps 20 houses plus one saloon. It was a town out of a dime novel, populated by cowboys and patrolled by a rugged, snowy-haired marshal named Dave Allison, who quickly befriended the young officer. Beyond the few rude streets of the town lay a landscape of desolation, through which Patton led mounted border patrols and, from the saddle, at the trot, hunted jackrabbits. Quote, "I like this sort of work," he wrote with satisfaction. "A lot." End quote. The hard, sterile desert life made a romantic impact on Patton, so much so that he wrote a poem about it. Quote, "The night wind stirs the cactus and shifts the sand over all. The horses squeal, the sentries curse, the lean coyotes call." End quote. During the political unrest in Mexico, a man who came to be called Pancho Villa rose and fell, and by the time Patton was writing poetry in the desert, Pancho Villa was exiled to the mountains where he developed a knack for guerrilla warfare and had acquired quite a loyal following. In January of 1916, Pancho Villa rounded up and executed 17 American citizens near Santa Isabel, Mexico. He then crossed the border into New Mexico, where he got into a firefight with the locals while raiding their towns. Woodrow Wilson then tasked General Pershing with marching across the border and capturing Pancho Villa. General Pershing brought Lieutenant Patton with him. After many long, hot months of finding no trace of the outlaw, Patton was sent on a foraging expedition with 10 soldiers, 2 civilian scouts, and 2 civilian drivers. After making the purchases for what the small army needed, he noticed a group of about 60, quote, very rough-looking Mexicans in the distance. One of the scouts with the foraging party identified them as part of Pancho Villa's outfit. Patton figured they must have come from a hacienda about 6 miles away that was a known hangout for the bandit. And so, convinced the outlaw was in the area, he abandoned the foraging expedition and made for the gang hangout. The vehicles approached the hacienda at full throttle. Patton and his men jumped out and surrounded the house. Patton himself ran around to the back of the house, but was stopped cold when 3 men on horseback appeared from around a corner. Quote, "One bullet threw gravel on me. I fired back with my new pistol 5 times. Then my men came around the corner and started to shoot. I did not know who was in the house. There were a lot of windows, only a few feet from our right side. Just as I got around the corner, 3 bullets hit about 7 feet from the ground and put adobe chips all over me." End quote. At this, Patton ordered his men to secure all the exits of the building. No one comes out. Quote, "I reloaded my pistol and started back when I saw a man on horse come right in front of me. I started to shoot him, but I remembered that Dave Allison had always said to shoot at the horse of an escaping man, and so I did, and broke the hip of the horse. He fell on his rider, and as it was only about 10 yards, we all hit him. He crumbled up." End quote. Then another man made a break from the hacienda to run away into the desert. Patton aimed and shot him dead. By the end of the shootout, they had failed to find Pancho Villa, but they had captured much of his top brass and family. Just as the group was packing up their vehicles to head back to base, 50 men appeared over the hill on horseback, firing wildly, shouting and thundering towards Patton's men at a blistering pace. Patton and his men hopped into their vehicles and made a break for it. And down the road a bit, he stopped to cut the telegraph wires along the road, hoping to prevent communication from spreading about his adventure until he at least returned to camp. In the weeks following the Pancho Villa incident, Patton was, for a brief moment, a household name and a national hero. He also had unintentionally made U.S. Army history, for it was the first time an American soldier had been transported into battle by motorized vehicle. Patton walked away with an important lesson in military theory that he would forever embrace: the necessity of speed. Soon after his 15 minutes of fame, the U.S. entered the First World War, and the American Army exploded from 130,000 men to 4.5 million. Ironically, as Patton moved up in rank and respect, he was discouraged that this removed him further from actual combat, and just as the entire world was at war, no less. He was searching for a command that would take him to the heart of battle, a command that was experimental and risky, one that wouldn't be bird-dogged by the general staff. Quote, "And what he soon found was a new, ugly, and utterly unproven weapon the British called the tank." End quote. After some consideration of the potential of this new weapon, Patton hesitantly took the opportunity to put together the first tank corps of the United States. He knew it was a risk, and that it would either prove useless in combat or magnificently powerful. He watched them in action. They were loud, clumsy, and required a lot of fuel, and yet resistant to machine gun fire, and they could deliver powerful artillery rounds on the go. They just might end the stalemate of the trenches. When he saw the French model tanks, he liked them immediately. They were lighter and faster than the British tanks. To him, these were the equivalent of a mounted knight. These were the new cavalry. And so with gusto, Patton began building his tank corps. In all things, he preached discipline and strict adherence to military code. One must first be a good soldier before they could be trusted with a tank. He was tough and relentless in training his men, but he was also dedicated to them. He made damn sure that supply lines were always productive. No soldier under Patton ever ate a cold meal. He demanded the best from his soldiers, and so he treated them the best. On August 24, 1918, the 304th Tank Brigade was officially mustered with 225 French-built tanks. The rest of the story of the 304th Tank Brigade is what I opened this episode with, exploits for which Patton won a Purple Heart. He had entered that war a captain and left it a colonel. The theory of tank warfare was tested and proven, and Patton, the Army's master of the sword, had written the book. The day before his tank brigade went into combat, Patton stood before the new tank corps and gave the following remarks, quote, "No tank is to be surrendered or abandoned to the enemy. If you are left alone in the midst of the enemy, keep shooting. If your gun is disabled, use your pistols and squash the enemy with your tracks. By quick changes of direction, cut them with the tail of the tank. If your motor is stalled and your gun broken, you hang on. Help will come. You are the first American tanks. You must establish the fact that American tanks do not surrender. As long as one tank is able to move, it must go forward. Its presence will save the lives of hundreds of infantry and kill many Germans. Finally, this is our big chance. What we have worked for. Make it worthwhile." Tchaikovsky gets me so amped. Next week, when Part 2 comes out, you'll hear a more complete version of the 1812 Overture that not only closes out the life of Patton, but also Season 1 of Written in Blood history. So Part 1 gets us up through World War I. Part 2, we see how Patton handles peacetime, now as a war hero, and how he makes history in the European theater. While you're waiting, go check out my sister's graphic design portfolio at cjdejulius.myportfolio.com. She's the one who produces all the incredible artwork for the show. Also, go entertain yourself with Dario's YouTube channel. If you ever need some freelance work, they are both excellent at what they do. And as always, I'll have links to both of them in the show notes. If you want to get a hold of me, my Twitter handle is @sdejulius, or you can reach me via the show Facebook page. And finally, if you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a patron. For as little as $1 a month, you can help me keep this whole thing going. Into Season 2, by the way. You can also leave me a rating or review wherever you listen, and those little stars just make my day. Alright, that is it. I will see you guys in a few days with Patton Part 2, The Force Multiplier.